like, hey guys, we could do it this way and it'd be a lot faster. And the whole world was like, no, man, you don't know what you're talking about, this and that. And so, in a sense, while he's riding in the car with him, he almost jumped out ahead using his ragtag scientist because he was able to see the problem from a different perspective. And I watched this one guy beat the entire world at sequencing the human genome. And I was like, man, if you could just learn the disciplines of science, it'll allow you to push the boundaries and actually explore. So it was almost my ADD brain thinking, man, if I could just buckle down and get a grip on the foundational rules in science and things that are in play, then I can figure out how to push the envelope wherever you go, because it gave you a chance to make this kind of creative expression that really other disciplines didn't allow you to go. And so that just became kind of an epiphany and awe-inspiring to me. And so that's kind of what's really got me in the track of, instead of going free med, I decided, hey, look, I'm going to stick with just science and just see how far it could go. And the way I looked at it was, in Louisiana, being here from the Bayou, there's chemical plants everywhere. And I was like, well, if I don't get into med school or whatever, then a chemistry degree is guaranteed to find me a job somewhere when I get out of school. So that became kind of the choice. And I guess a certain point about my senior year, I was trying to graduate on time. And, you got P-Chem or quantum, you've got biochem, and I've got all these upper level chemistries. I was doing undergraduate research as well as tutoring for organic and general chemistry. And I don't know, I joke about it. I don't know if it was an aneurysm but it felt like my brain popped at a certain point. And at that point, it was almost like chemistry and science became intuitive. I'll use the example from like martial arts. If you go take 2 weeks of karate classes and you get in a fight, chances are you're going to get your brains beat out, because everything you're doing, you're having to think, okay, block, do this. But if you've got somebody that's been doing martial arts for decades, then it becomes internalized and it almost becomes intuition. And at a certain point in my senior year, it felt like my brain almost became intuitive about science, where I could see something and almost react with it with a very good hypothesis to test and work my way through. And I just like the ability that science always offered a problem to solve. And by my personality and by nature, I always look for problems to solve. And considering science is nothing but problems, it was kind of like, hey, here's an entire farm of problems you can just work through and kind of test your ability. And so that became kind of the passion, was like, hey, let's find a bigger challenge. Can I find a bigger problem to try to solve? And that's kind of where it kind of began. And I think at the end of grad school, I'd gotten excited. Pat did well enough on the MCAT that I got accepted to LSU Shreveport to go to med school. I was accepted to Texas A&M for graduate school in chemistry, and as well as Vanderbilt for chemistry. Uh, at Texas A&M was actually ranked higher in chemistry, but the fields of study that they were predominantly in were material science and physical chemistry. And I'll be honest, I hated physical chemistry. Like that would have been a class, and every chemist that's been through quantum or statistical thermo, I always like to say, if you could do it without the math, it would have been like sitting down watching an episode of The Twilight Zone, because you're hearing it, it's tickling your brain, but then they're like, okay, now we're going to do the math to prove it. And 4 hours later, through path integrals and differential equations, you've suddenly found out why the electron is sitting in some field instead of being a particle unless you look at it, and all this type of stuff. And I didn't like the math part of it, but I loved the challenge of it. And so I ended up going to Vanderbilt, where they were really had this kind of collaborative approach to everything. They looked at it like, whether you were the chemistry department, physics, everybody was trying to tie into the medical research. So if you were doing chemistry, they were trying to find a partnership within the medical school to do some type of medical research. And to me, that was absolutely amazing. And I remember in my PhD qualifying exam, my PI directly, we were talking about it, and he said, well, Kris, he said, the really big, no single discipline can solve the really big problems. He was like, it is always a collaborative approach. He said, because the big problems require big answers, and no single discipline has the capability to deliver that. He said, so, and we were doing cancer research at Vanderbilt, and we were looking at site-specific, stereo-specific adduction of lipid peroxidation products on the minor groove of DNA, which, why was there a repair mechanism? Was there something structural? So we had everything from structural biologists using high field NMR to get solution structures, of these oligomers. We were transfecting them into cells, forcing cells to replicate, and then going back and sequencing the mistakes it was making. And I was doing the synthetic work to actually put these things together. And so that was kind of the graduate part. But you got to see this really collaborative work to go, hey, let's go solve a really big problem and we'll work together. And so we had three PIs. We were all funded by the NIH and pretty well funded at that because it was cancer research. So it was just kind of a progression. And I think that was one of the big ones that I picked up was that in grad school was this idea of collaborating, having, instead of being a master of one skill, if you had a concept or an understanding of multiple disciplines, you were able to accomplish more. Even if you weren't the best at one thing, if you understood how molecular biology was going to use some of their techniques, then and you understood the chemistry, the kind of the backbone of what was going on, that information would allow you to aggregate things and come up with a better solution or a better way of doing it. And I think that really just kind of inspired me looking at cancer research. And I think what really got me was I started looking around then as a challenge.
Mm.
And I thought, man, where would be the brightest place? I thought of like, what is the NFL for scientists? And to me, that was the pharmaceutical industry,
Mm.
because you would go look. And I remember when I started at the end of my grad school, I started going on job interviews. And I remember I went to Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck, Valiance in California. And I remember sitting down in the interview process and I'm like, these are the brightest people on earth. I remember thinking that I was like, they're seeing solutions to the problem I can't, meaning that I couldn't even see the problem and they already had the answer to the problem I couldn't even find yet. And so that to me was awe inspiring. And so I really wanted to find out, was I capable, was I a big fish in a little pond? Or could I get out into deep water and really try to solve and work with what would be the brightest minds out there? It's kind of a means of challenging yourself. I mean, how do you get better unless you really take on tasks that are beyond your current skill set? Let's say you've got a current skill set of 5. Well, if you try to go after something that's 6 or 7 on a difficulty scale, you're either going to fail or you're going to adapt and develop better skill sets to try to tackle that problem. And so that was my goal, kind of been my career all along, was how can I find the next mountain to climb, if you will.
That's really a really good answer. There were a couple of things that came to mind. So as you're describing some of your chemistry experience, I remember in quantum physics, essentially every answer ended in some level of decimal point, and every answer, whether or not if you had it right or wrong, was whether or not if you had the third level of the decimal point correct or not. And I mean, it was very frustrating for me as well because it was like, well, look, I mean, an early rounding problem in my calculator could quickly, become a wrong answer then. And so, you know,
Absolutely. I had
similar sort
my
of
my
situation.
PChem professor had a knack for confusing the units. Like he would start in it and he'd be like, all right, we'll calculate the energy, but he would purposely give you some units that didn't match. So if you didn't catch it, you'd go through everything correct and solve it, but your answer would be wrong because you weren't of that dimensionally analysis of the units, and you'd recognize it when you integrated it. You did this, and oh, I know. Like it was almost. I feel like physical chemistry is almost like you go through 3 years of chemistry, you get to P-Chem, and they're like, okay, this is what's really happening. It was real cool that we told you some approximations. We told you about the ideal gas law, and then you get to P-Chem, and they're like, yeah, there is no ideal gas. You're like, wait, what? And then all your other chemistry is like your electron's a particle, and then you get to P-Chem, and they're like, well, it's really a wave function. It's only a particle if you look at it. And you're like, wait, what? And so it's almost like science is like an onion. You're peeling off the layer, and it can't help but bring tears to your eyes, whether it's joy or sorrow. I think on the other side of it, after you're out of it, it becomes joy. But in the midst of it, you got like 10 or 12 kids suffering through quantum mechanics, and you're just like, I just need to complete this so I can graduate.
Right, right. That's the advantage I feel like a mind has whenever you start thinking about, look, one of these days I'll be in the business world, whether or not if I'm actually applying this the same way, at least I have the background for making that decision once I get out in the world. But yeah. So I guess talk a little bit about your transition as well in terms of you have a pretty broad past as you described, but overall, you transitioned as well to clinical labs and diagnostic testing. How did that happen, and what essentially put you in this space?
All right, so it kind of like so. At first, I started in pharma